Good morning. My name is Marie Rienzo, and I want to welcome you to the NIH Office of Disease Prevention's Methods Mind the Gap webinar series. This series explores research design, measurement, intervention, data analysis, and other methods of interest to prevention science. Our goal is to engage the prevention research community in thought-provoking discussions to promote the use of the best available methods and to support the development of better methods. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items. You can submit questions during the webinar by clicking on the question mark in the WebEx toolbar. Please direct your questions to all panelists. We will open the floor to questions that have been submitted via WebEx at the conclusion of today's talk. The slides and video recording will be posted on our website, prevention.nih.gov/mindthegap, in approximately 1 week. You will receive an email when they are available. Lastly, we would appreciate your feedback about today's webinar. Upon closing the WebEx meeting, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation. We would appreciate your feedback as it will help us improve this webinar series. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. David M. Murray, Associate Director for Prevention and the Director of the Office of Disease Prevention.
Thank you, Marie. Today's speaker is Dr. Siobhan Phillips. Dr. Phillips is an associate professor in the Department of Preventive Medicine at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine and the Director of Physical Activity Promotion at the Robert H. Lurie Comprehensive Cancer Center. Her interdisciplinary research is focused on understanding the determinants and outcomes of physical activity, designing, testing, and optimizing innovative and effective behavior change interventions, and disseminating and implementing this research to practice with a primary focus on cancer survivors. Dr. Phillips' work has been funded by the National Institute of Aging and the National Cancer Institute. She has an MPH from Harvard and a PhD in kinesiology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She completed her postdoctoral training in the Cancer Prevention Fellowship at the National Cancer Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Phillips.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm excited to talk today about using technology to understand and promote physical activity behavior. And just to note, I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. So I'm sure this is not a surprise to most of the audience. You know, there are many benefits of physical activity participation, including a reduced risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, many cancers, dementia, anxiety and depression, falls and falls-related injuries, and also improved quality of life, cognition, sleep, bone health, physical function. It also can aid in maintaining a weight or losing weight, and preventing weight regain following initial weight loss. And because of all of these recommendations or all of these benefits of physical activity, there are actually federal guidelines. The first set of them were developed in 2008, and they just updated them in 2018. And the physical activity guidelines suggest that individuals should engage in moderate intensity aerobic activity for 150 minutes per week, and muscle strengthening activities 2 times per week for the entire body. And in general, the new addition in the 2018 guidelines is to address sedentary behavior and the idea that sitting more or moving more and sitting less throughout the day is important, and some physical activity and some activity is better than none, because adults who do any amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity gain some health benefits. So why does physical activity matter? In addition to kind of all of these benefits, there are also high costs associated with inadequate physical activity. These data, this is from the Physical Activity Guidelines Committee. There's $117 billion in annual healthcare costs because of inadequate physical activity, and 10% of premature mortality can actually be attributed to inadequate physical activity. Despite all of the benefits of physical activity and the potential costs of physical inactivity, only about 1/4 of Americans meet both the aerobic and muscle strengthening guidelines that are proposed in the 2018 guidelines. So obviously, despite all these benefits, we are not doing a very good job getting people to be active. And so kind of trying to think about, why this is the case and kind of understanding physical activity behavior is important. And technology, especially smartphones and wearables, are becoming increasingly ubiquitous, and they may offer a useful tool for understanding and promoting physical activity behavior and helping to increase the number of people meeting the physical activity guidelines. The latest data indicate that 96% of Americans own cell phones, and 81% of these own a smartphone, and that about 22% of Americans own wearables. So this is things like Fitbits or other types of accessories that monitor activity or monitor just kind of heart rate. It could be other types of wearables as well. So this is particularly important because what we know about physical activity right now is primarily based on infrequent self-reports, because what has kind of been even the gold standard of measurement right now, kind of free living measurement, using accelerometers or even direct observation, we don't know that much about physical activity outside of kind of these discrete time points. And so technology could actually help us to understand physical activity behavior better, because it provides an opportunity to collect a high volume of data, both actively and passively, from participants at a greater frequency and lower cost. And it may also help us engage individuals who we might not get to come into a research lab, or who might not show up to a community center where a lot of our work, a lot of research is conducted. It can also allow for collection of many data streams at many levels unobtrusively, and can allow us to more easily integrate physical activity data with other important data streams. So we can integrate physical activity data with self-reported surveys or feedback from participants. We can pair with other sensors like heart rate monitors or glucose monitors. We can look at GIS or GPS data. We could even potentially link it to medical records data and medical and actual health and disease outcomes from those data. We could also link it to publicly available data on crime, on weather, and also even potentially get more information on context by having people upload videos or pictures of where they're being active, and even connect to social media and kind of see how people are talking about physical activity or engaging with content related to physical activity on social media. And all of this data could potentially help us get at more information about physical activity, including synchronicity, so the extent to which explanatory factors co-occur in time and space with physical activity, instability, so patterns or fluctuations and changes in physical activity and the factors that influence physical activity, and sequentiality. So this is kind of the temporal sequence of antecedents and outcomes of physical activity behaviors. And ultimately, all of these data could potentially help us understand physical activity behavior better, which could lead to the ability to design more effective physical activity interventions. And so, what might this look like in terms of the application in the real world? So you could essentially gather information on where a person is located if they have a smartphone from their smartphone. You could collect information on, what they're doing right now, where they're at, so get at some additional context besides just geographic location. You can also collect information on motivational factors, symptoms, and be able to understand how those are impacting physical activity behavior. You can have them wear a monitor. There's research grade monitors like accelerometers, but there's also, now consumer wearables have much longer battery life, so we can actually get at physical activity for, actually objectively monitor physical activity for longer and longer periods of times without having to necessarily worry about battery life. You can collect information on weather, crime, and medical records data. So you could get a more complete picture of not just, what physical activity they're doing, but kind of the context in which they're doing it, and better understand what is influencing physical activity on a day-to-day basis, to get a more complete picture of, what's influencing physical activity behavior. And so in terms of thinking about how all of this information or how these tools could help us promote physical activity, Tech-supported interventions generally have a greater reach and are more scalable than traditional face-to-face interventions because they require fewer resources and are generally less burdensome on participants. They don't have to come to a facility to exercise with us. They can do it, in the comfort of their own home or their neighborhood. Technology also allows us to more easily remotely monitor patients. So during, if a traditional home-based trials, you may have people fill out paper logs and mail them back to you, or, you wouldn't actually assess their activity until kind of the beginning and the end. But with technology, you might actually be able to monitor them remotely and kind of see when they're falling off the wagon. And ultimately, we can integrate physical activity with data streams to allow us to better understand physical activity and improve and tailor our interventions and get our interventions out to the people who need them the most. And so, the question then, of course, is, well, do technology-supported interventions work? And meta-analyses from the general population have been conducted. There's been a lot of different types of meta-analyses that have looked at, different types of technology interventions. Overall, I would say that most indicate technology-supported interventions have a moderate effect on physical activity. However, some reviews have actually found that there is no effect on physical activity. It is important to note that very few of these interventions tested technology alone. Many included some human elements such as support calls or coaching calls, and this could enhance the effectiveness of the technology. So we really don't necessarily know if it's the technology or the alone or the technology in combination with some of these other more traditional intervention approaches. So I'm going to go through some examples of how we are using technology in our lab to understand physical activity behavior, and then I'll go through some examples on how we're using it to actually try to promote physical activity. And so the first example I'm going to go through is the IMPACT study, and this study was funded by the Lynn Sage Cancer Research Foundation, and the goal was to explore the relationship between physical activity, clinical, motivational, and patient-reported outcomes using ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. And EMA involves repeated sampling of subjects' current behaviors and experiences in real time in subjects' natural environments. EMA aims to minimize recall bias, maximize ecological validity, and allow the study of microprocesses that influence behavior in real-world contexts. And so, as Dr. Murray mentioned, most of my research focuses on cancer survivors. So we were actually looking at physical activity during chemotherapy because the data suggests that physical activity tends to decline during treatment. But again, most of these data are based on snapshots or recalls. And so we were kind of interested in looking at objectively what's happening during chemotherapy. And we recruited participants from oncology clinics to participate in 3 bursts of data collection at the beginning, middle, and end of chemotherapy. Each burst was 10 days long, and ideally we had participants enroll prior to their first dose of chemo, but they could enroll after they had received 1 dose of chemo. And then each of these 10-day bursts included a 3-day pre-chemo 3 days pre-chemotherapy, the day of chemotherapy, and then the 7 days following chemotherapy, or the whole week of chemotherapy. And during each burst of data collection, they wore an actigraph 24/7 on the hip during the day and the wrist at night. And they completed 4 text message prompts. They were kind of like the beginning, mid to late morning, late afternoon, and then evening. At all 4 prompts, we assessed symptoms, including physical and cognitive functioning, pain, fatigue, depression, anxiety, and overall affect. At the first prompt, we assessed motivational factors for physical activity that day, including self-efficacy, goal setting, and outcome expectations. And at the end of the day, we assessed these same motivational factors for MVPA, for moderate and vigorous physical activity for the next day. Additionally, everyone completed a traditional online questionnaire battery at each time point. And then at the end, they also did a process evaluation to get some information on acceptability of the procedures. We also collected medical record data on treatment, pathology reports, body weight, and immune response at the end of the study for all participants. And then about half of the sample also wore a Fitbit from the time of study enrollment until 2 weeks after the last cycle of chemotherapy. So we had a lot of data. And we had 75 women who consented and were eligible to participate. And of those, 84% completed all 3 time points. You can see the reasons for withdrawal. A lot of it had to do with discontinuation of chemotherapy or health complications. The first, there were some people who did withdraw because they thought that the study was too burdensome, which we did anticipate some of that. In general, our sample looked pretty similar to the typical breast cancer survivor population or breast cancer patient population. They were 48 and a half years old on average, mostly early stage disease. About half reported very good excellent status. Most were on average overweight. We had about 23% of our sample was non-white and 13% was Hispanic Latino. Most were highly educated, working at least part-time, and about half were pretty high income. And so this graph is, I don't expect you to really be able to read this, that's kind of the point of it. This graph represents moderate and vigorous physical activity over the 30 days in the study for each participant. Overall, they engaged in approximately 20 minutes per day of moderate and vigorous physical activity, which is comparable, if not a bit higher than most breast cancer survivor studies. What we found was daily physical activity, moderate and vigorous physical activity declined across chemotherapy, and physical activity was higher on the days preceding chemotherapy than on days following chemotherapy. And about 75% of the difference in moderate and vigorous physical activity was actually attributed to within-person variation, which you can see by how much these lines are going up and down in this graph. So some days they're really active, some days they're not. There's a lot of variation in people's behavior, although here at the bottom, those are kind of the people that are not active at all. They're consistently not active. And so we used a mixed model controlling for relevant covariates to examine the relationship between daily symptoms and moderate and vigorous physical activity, looking at both between subjects effects, which we defined as the association between overall average daily symptom measurements across the 30 days, and then within subjects effects, which we were defined as an individual's daily deviation from their own 30-day average. Overall, higher average functional limitations for walking were associated with less moderate and vigorous physical activity, while increased overall average cognitive functioning was associated with increased physical activity. And then on days when participants reported better affect and cognitive functioning than their average, they engaged in more moderate and vigorous physical activity. In contrast, on days when they experienced worse than average anxiety, fatigue, pain, and physical functioning for everyday activities and walking, they reported less moderate and vigorous physical activity, which is, kind of what you would expect, that on, days that they're feeling worse, they're less active. And then we also conducted another mixed model controlling for relevant covariates to examine the relationship between social cognitive theory variables and MVPA. So this is looking at the current days, so the morning measurements, and then the activity they achieved throughout the day, to examine the role of motivational factors on moderate and vigorous physical activity in this population. What we found was no between-person effects were significant. However, on days when participants reported better than, higher than average self-efficacy, physical and psychological outcome expectations, and goal setting, they engaged in more moderate and vigorous physical activity that day. Again, this is kind of what we see in the snapshot literature, where we're looking at kind of average self-efficacy and average physical activity, but we're seeing this also at the day level, so that some of the variation in daily activity is actually due to variation potentially in motivational factors. And so this is just one example of how you could potentially use technology to collect more data to understand physical activity. These more granular data can help us better understand fluctuations in activity. And we were looking more at the day level, but you can get even more granular than that. So you could look at, the 30 minutes before a prompt. You could look at the activity 30 minutes before a prompt, 30 minutes after a prompt, an hour. You could look at lagged effects of previous day symptoms on next day symptoms. There's a lot of different ways you could look at these data to understand physical activity behavior. So in summary, kind of thinking about how technology might help us better understand physical activity, I think there's a lot of opportunities. Technology is relatively easy to use. Overall, our patients found they really didn't have any issues using the technology. They, used their own smartphones, so they were really familiar with it. There really were not, too many issues with that. It gives us, there's widespread adoption of technology, so we could potentially, look at these relationships in various groups of individuals. It was relatively unobtrusive, except for us prompting them 4 times a day. That part was not unobtrusive, but it only took them about 2 minutes to actually answer the prompts. These data may be more accurate, at least these daily level data, kind of these in the moment data, may be more accurate than recalls. We were able to collect a lot of information that to help us better understand what may be influencing physical activity during chemotherapy. And this could be applied to many other contexts and settings. But of course, there's a lot of challenges. It can be burdensome. We had, I believe it was about an 80% response rate to our prompts, and we did not actually incentivize them to answer the prompts. In some EMA studies, you do get incentivized for every prompt you answer. But it could be burdensome. Like the prompts can come at times when people don't want them, or if you're wearing all of these different monitoring devices, it can get a little overwhelming and burdensome on participants to remember to wear them and charge them, and answer all these prompts or turn on different features of their phones. There's also tech challenges. So, technology is not perfect. There can be issues with battery, data not transmitting, people not carrying their phones. A lot of different issues that can come up with the technology. And then in thinking about EMA or kind of monitoring even just monitoring people at this high level of this high intensity level, it could actually be an intervention in and of itself. They feel there could be some kind of Hawthorne effect. And so what we're observing is, actually not true. It's kind of in response to this heavy level of monitoring. But at least, there are many devices that don't give feedback. So you hope that that's not the case. And when you're sending prompts to people over and over again, it can start to get mindless and people just kind of, are always continuously picking the same response and not actually reading your questions. So that's, of course, a concern. And then, I think these are getting people there's always privacy concerns, on the information, on the data you're collecting. Some people might view it as sensitive or not want to share information, especially when you start getting into like GPS data, or even, now you can even potentially get at social contexts, and they can collect data on like other people's phones and who you're next to. And so there can be issues with privacy concerns. And then, what I'm talking about here was all aerobic physical activity. There's pretty good ways to measure aerobic activity remotely and using technology, but there aren't those tools for strength training or resistance training exercises. And so, that presents a challenge in and of itself to try to figure out how we might monitor those activities, because they also are important. And then, of course, this is the amount of data you get from doing a study like this is very large, and we really need some advanced methods for making sense of these large volumes of data. I mean, we've only even probably scratched the surface on what we could potentially do with these data. There's tons of different questions we could ask. And I think, as more and more data become available, our ability to handle these data are going to get better and better, and we'll be able to make even more sense of it and understand physical activity at an even more detailed level. So now switching gears a bit to the intervention piece and how we can use technology and interventions, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the real world examples in our lab. And, looking at how we're actually using technology to promote physical activity. And actually, in our case, we are working on trying to optimize technology-supported interventions. So in considering technology-supported intervention, starting off with a physical activity promotion for a technology-supported physical activity promotion intervention, there is a long list of different potential options you could consider including in your intervention. So there's educational information. You could have a coach, you could have teams, you could give people, buddies where you give them Fitbits, you could have incentives, there's extra games, there's online group webinars, Fitbits, you could give them an app that could have a variety of different features. You could have text messages, exercise videos. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so it's kind of in thinking about, well, where do you start, or what is kind of the optimal pieces, or really the components that matter. If I was using the classical treatment package approach, which I have done in several interventions, I would pick my favorites from that list, throw them all together into the intervention black box, and test them in a randomized control trial, comparing my intervention to a control. I want to note there's absolutely nothing wrong with this approach. However, there are some limitations with this approach. In the best case scenario, you'll have a significant effect. Your intervention worked. However, you won't know which components are contributing to the effects, whether the inclusion of one component impacts the effect of another, whether a component's contribution offsets its cost, whether all components are really needed, how to make interventions more effective, efficient, and scalable. And then on the flip side, you could also end up with a non-significant effect, and you won't know whether any component is worth retaining, whether one component had a negative effect that offset the positive effect of another, and specifically what went wrong and how to do it better next time. And you would have thrown this all together without actually including your target population in the process. And so this is where MOST, or the multi-phase optimization strategy, kind of comes into play. MOST is an engineering-inspired framework for optimizing and evaluating interventions to efficiently and systematically identify the most promising intervention components or component levels. A component is anything that can be reasonably separated out for study and can include things like specific retention strategies, or an intervention feature like a Fitbit, a coach, or anything like that. And typically, most studies that use the MOST framework use 2 levels, which can be on-off or some type of variable intensity, so like 6 versus 12 coaching calls. And this framework has really been promoted and really been developed by Linda Collins at Penn State. And MOST involves 4 phases. The first phase is the preparation phase, which involves development of a conceptual model, identifying candidate intervention components, and identifying the optimization criteria you're basing decisions on. The second phase is the optimization phase, in which you actually estimate the individual contributions of intervention components and the interactions between components, decide which to retain at what levels or settings, and then finally you ideally assemble these components into an intervention and evaluate it in a randomized control trial. However, if you do not have enough effective components, you might go back to the preparation phase and repeat. You can see there's this reciprocal arrow or bidirectional arrow, and this suggests that you're continuously trying to optimize an intervention. And MOST lends itself particularly well to technology-based interventions because many components are easy to turn on or off. So, it may just be as simple as clicking a button to give a participant a component or not. And so I'm going to talk about how we're kind of applying MOST in our ongoing studies within our lab. And so I was funded by an NCI Career Development Award to use MOST in breast cancer survivors to design an optimized physical activity intervention for this population. This is a 2-phase study that is trying to answer the questions of if we build it, will they come? And then will it work? The goal of phase 1 was really to understand survivors' interests and preferences, use this data to develop the interventions to test in phase 2, and then and really engage them in the development of the intervention. And then phase 2, the goal was to apply MOST using a factorial experiment to identify which components or component levels significantly increase average daily minutes of moderate and vigorous physical activity, and then to hopefully build a more scalable intervention made up of only components that have a detectable effect on moderate and vigorous physical activity and cost less than $550. And we decided on that because that's what's covered by by cardiac rehab. It's kind of the average of what's covered by cardiac rehab and the DPM. And so we actually recruited nationally for this study using the Army of Women. And we were really trying to consider real-world implementation from the start. So we required no on-site study visits. Everything was done completely remotely. And we finished data collection for phase 2 just about a year ago and are getting pretty close to being able to start getting some of those manuscripts out. In the interest of time today, I'm just mostly going to be discussing our phase 2 data, but I'm happy to answer any questions about phase 1 if people have them at the end. So ultimately, based on our work from phase 1, these were the components that were deemed the highest rated and most feasible. Our core intervention includes a self-monitoring app and the Fitbit. And the components we were testing were a Fitbit buddy, where we gave a person picked a buddy from their life and they were sent a Fitbit. Deluxe app, which had some additional app modules, including a survivor spotlight where we highlighted someone who had been active, and then a news feed where we posted research related to physical activity and cancer on a weekly basis. App notifications on progress and kind of just general behavior change tips. Bi-weekly coaching calls, and then an online gym where they gave access to online videos and were sent a weekly schedule on how to use them. This is a full factorial experiment, and participants are randomly assigned to each component, which means they can get anywhere from 0 to 5 other components. And the ultimate goal of the intervention is to gradually increase survivors' moderate and vigorous physical activity to reach that 150 minutes per week over a 12-week period with a 12-week follow-up. And participants complete online patient-reported outcome assessments and wear the accelerometer for 7 consecutive days at baseline, week 12, and week 24. And they also completed optional dried blood spots at baseline, 12 weeks and 24 weeks, and then a process evaluation at 12 and 24 weeks. And so this is what the 32 condition experiment looks like. I want to emphasize this should not be considered a 32-arm randomized control trial. We're never actually comparing individual conditions. Instead, we're comparing everyone who has a component shaded in purple to everyone who does not have the component shaded. For example, for coaching calls, we're comparing everyone in conditions 1 through 16 to everyone in conditions 17 to 32. This means everyone is used in our analyses, so our sample size is equivalent to what we would need in a traditional RCT. And so I'm going to briefly go over how each component's implemented, since we never actually see these people. So we mailed all participants the Fitbit with instructions for downloading the Fitbit app and instructions for downloading the Fit2Thrive app, which they can do through the App Store and using a QR code that we provide them. And they are automatically, when they scan that code, given either the standard app or the deluxe app, depending on which condition they are assigned to. And like I said, the standard app is really self-monitoring, where this deluxe app has some additional features that may help facilitate behavior change. And then participants who are assigned to coaching calls are scheduled to receive a biweekly call to discuss their progress and some behavior change techniques. The coach is able to actually see their progress through the app database in real time. And then participants assigned to the tailored text messages get 2 to 3 messages per day, focused on social cognitive theory constructs and feedback on progress. Individuals in the online gym get weekly automated emails with a schedule and link to workouts. And then for the Fitbit buddy, they were able to choose a buddy from their personal life. We sent that person an email to screen and consent and agree to share their Fitbit data with us. And then they were sent an instruction packet and Fitbit through the mail. And then we sent both the participant and the buddy a biweekly email with strategies for how they could support each other to increase physical activity. And so we screened 419 women, and we had 269 actually be randomized, and 265 received the intervention. We retained about 94% at 12 weeks and about 91% at 24 weeks, and have about 80% of the sample with valid physical activity data at all 3 time points. And our demographics are a little bit younger than you would see in a typical breast cancer survivor study, which is probably a result of the of the fact that we're using technology, but we did have a wide range from 24 to 75. Otherwise, they look pretty similar to the general survivor population. We had 46 states represented, most early stage disease, and an average were 3 years since diagnosis. And so in terms of our preliminary data, when we looked at overall change in moderate and vigorous physical activity, we find that MVPA significantly increased by 59.3 minutes per week and 8.5 minutes per day. And we saw a 21.5% increase in the number of women who were reaching the physical activity guidelines, which is actually, these effects are really similar to a study of another study that was actually a tapered on-site to home-based 12-week intervention, behavior change intervention for breast cancer survivors that included 6 group sessions, 12 supervised sessions in the first 9 weeks, followed by 3 weekly one-on-one coaching sessions. They observed a 68-minute increase in accelerometer measured MVPA. I should mention this is the accelerometer data, and a 22% increase in the number of women meeting the guidelines. So overall, this was encouraging and very promising considering we never saw these people. They just used our app or whatever other components they got, and everything was kind of, our intervention was relatively low touch compared to that. But when we looked at the main effects and interaction effects of the 5 intervention components using an intention to treat ANOVA, controlling for accelerometer wear time, we find that none of the on levels of the components are superior to the off levels. When you look at the actual means, you see a small positive effect for support calls, Fitbit Buddy, and app notifications. But interestingly enough, you actually see that having the Deluxe app off seems to be better than on when you just look at the means, and the same with the online gym. And so when I first looked at these data, I thought, oh my gosh, this is my K award. My career is over before it started. But I've had some time to process this and think about it. And I think there's a lot to the story here, and that we'll hopefully be able to understand these data better. We've collected a ton of other data to help us figure out why these components are working or not. And when you look at other interventions that have used most, you see something similar that there's only 1, maybe 2 components that have a main effect. Which, from a public health perspective is actually not a bad story. And I think that, when we dig a bit deeper, we're going to see some heterogeneity in response to our intervention where some people will increase, them will stay the same or even decrease. And that, is what's driving our mean changes. And so I think kind of understanding this is going to be important to help us make sense of these data. And just kind of like, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is, well, maybe our intervention, people just really didn't like it. They didn't use it. When we're looking at those data and the fact that we have no effect. But what we see is that most people were actually satisfied with the app, the intervention delivery, and the overall study experience, which was encouraging because I'd never done a study where we literally never saw people. And so in general, it seemed like they felt like the study, they positively rated the study overall. And then, when you look at adherence, we do see some variability based on the components, which I think could be an indication to us of thinking about whether that is the right component or, gives us an opportunity to see that if it did work for people, if it did work for some people, is this really because they used it and it didn't work for other people because they didn't use it? And we had 67% of people report that they use their app 5 to 6 times a week. We had really good adherence to the Fitbit. They wore it on 95% of study days. We had 99% of support calls complete. The buddy, people, 88% reported discussing the study with their buddy or exercise 1 time a week. 60% reported at least some support from the buddy for exercise each week. When you look at the online gym, this is where we see some variability. 54% report using, only 54% report using it more than 1 time a week. 42% report that they never use the online gym. And this was a relatively low touch component. We gave them the information, but we didn't really, we gave them these schedules, we gave them the resources, but we didn't, really push them to use it. It was kind of like they could use it if they wanted to. And then we had 57% of our app notifications marked as read, but this means that they actually clicked on it. We assume that more people saw them than just that. And then, so we use some of our preliminary data from feasibility and acceptability from phase 1 and 2 of Fit2Thrive, and then also our data from the first observational study was talking about the impact study. and got 2 additional grants from NCI. The first is an R21 that was funded about a year ago. It's a pilot RCT, so I'm using the RCT approach here to kind of test feasibility and acceptability of a tech-supported physical activity intervention in metastatic breast cancer patients. This is a population where not a lot of interventions have been developed because I think the feeling before was, they had a really short life. So their diagnosis is terminal. Now they're living a lot longer, and so it's kind of a good opportunity to start thinking about health promotion for these women. And this is a 12-week intervention. Unlike the original Fit2Thrive, we're not focusing on that 150 minutes. We're actually focusing on daily steps, and we are tailoring their daily step goal based on their progress from the previous day and their symptom rating for the current day. And then we actually give them options to choose their goal for that day. And then we also added a social component where participants can see each other's relative progress and communicate with each other. And then they also get weekly coaching calls. And then we're looking at moderate and vigorous physical activity measured by the accelerometer, patient-reported outcomes, feasibility, acceptability, and functional performance at baseline and then 12 weeks. And then our control group is a waitlist group where a waitlist attention control. So we have them download a commercially available app, and then they also get weekly coaching calls about healthy lifestyle topics. And so, we're really trying to establish feasibility, acceptability here with kind of the end game of trying to figure out how to optimize an intervention for this population because, there are fewer of these survivors. And so I think something that was remote, we could reach more of them and, help promote their health. We actually just started our first cohort of 25 women 3 weeks ago. And this is about half of our target. So far, so good. Of course, working at the early stage tech issues, but so far it seems to be received pretty well. And then the other study is an MPI R01 with Lisa Cannabis for Trauma at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This study was also funded about a year ago, and we plan to start recruiting in the next month. It's actually a non-responders trial or a single randomized trial. And the purpose of the study is to determine the optimal augmentation tactics to a minimal MVPA promotion intervention for increasing physical activity and then also improving symptom burden and functional performance in inactive breast and endometrial cancer survivors. It's a 6-month study with a 6-month follow-up, and our ultimate goal is to get to that 150 minutes of MVPA, again, similar to the Fit2Thrive. And we'll be measuring very similar outcomes to Fit2Thrive MB, looking at physical activity, symptom burden, functional performance at 6 and 12 months. And then everybody in this study actually starts off getting the minimal intervention. So there's no randomization at the beginning. And this minimal intervention consists of the Fitbit that's actually integrated into the electronic health record. So at both sites, we use Epic. And then they get weekly emails through the patient-facing portal, which is MyChart, from the study team that's endorsed by their oncologist as well, that gives them feedback on their progress and some healthy and some tips on behavior change. And then so it's pretty minimal. That's all automated. And then if they actually have a visit with their oncologist during the study, the oncologist gets an alert in their inbox the day of the patient's appointment and we give them some talking points to discuss with the patient. And the idea is that by integrating the Fitbit into the EHR, it's elevating the importance of physical activity for patients, and kind of elevating it to part of their clinical care. And during the intervention, we're going to be evaluating for non-response every 4 weeks. If they fail to meet less than 80% of their physical activity goal over the previous 4 weeks, then is actually when they get randomized. And there they get randomized to either get biweekly coaching calls or the online gym for the remainder of the 6-month study period. And if they keep responding, they just keep going. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of tell, does this minimal intervention work? And if not, kind of what is the next best, what's the next step up strategy? So again, these are just some examples of how we're using, how you can use technology to promote and understand physical activity. And, again, there's lots of opportunities and challenges here with using it for interventions. Like, easy to use, you can reach a large number of people where they are, you get rich data in real time, you can monitor them in real time, it's lower cost than having them come there, can easily allow for turning on or off components. but there's challenges. Again, there's burden. They have to wear their Fitbits. They have to, for the Fit2Thrive MB, they have to answer their daily symptom survey, tech issues, and then I think the issue, there's always an issue of sustained engagement. How do we keep people using this? And then, how do we actually kind of implement these interventions at a larger scale and keep up with changes in technology? And like with the measurements or kind of the monitoring, we're looking at aerobic activity, and there's challenges with doing this for non-aerobic activity. And then I think there's also an issue of how we engage social networks or support, or like how we engage people in this. And if it needs to be calls or video chats, or if there's a way to kind of make technology do some of that work for us. And so just kind of wrapping up here, I think this is one of my favorite quotes. Significant problems we face cannot be solved by the same level of thinking that created them. I think, it's important to take a few steps back, consider what we're dealing with here. Physical activity is complex. Unlike in mice, when we turn off the lights out, people don't just start running on their wheel. There's been many interventions that have demonstrated efficacy for promoting physical activity, yet the majority of the U.S. population is inactive. And I think we need to start thinking about doing something different and, getting more creative. And technology is one tool that may allow us to better integrate multiple data sources to understand and promote physical activity, develop effective interventions, kind of more easily answer the questions of like, what's the best middle intervention for which outcome, how much physical activity is needed for which outcomes, what works for who, when, under what conditions, and, how much should be tailored to hopefully ultimately kind of to close the gap between research and practice, and ultimately, improve physical activity participation at a population level, and in turn, disease outcomes. So I'm happy to take questions, but I first want to acknowledge all the participants, my collaborators, and the funding agencies who supported my work, especially the NIH.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Very interesting, lots of material. And we have more questions from the audience than I can possibly get through in the time that remains. So I'll jump into them, and we'll try to touch on some of them.
Yeah.
An initial question about outcome measures. In the first project that you mentioned, you were using moderate to vigorous physical activity as the outcome, either minutes or the number of folks who met some target. Was that measured with an accelerometer or some other device?
So that was objectively measured using the accelerometer, but we do also have, in all of our studies, we also collect self-report data, and then in now all of our interventions, we also have Fitbit data throughout the course of the intervention.
So it sounds like then, on the basis of that answer, that you favor accelerometers for your major outcome when you're looking at physical activity, as opposed to a Fitbit or something else.
I do when we're looking at it as an outcome, because they don't provide feedback, they're research grade. And so I do think that I do prefer that as an actual outcome measure, but I kind of view Fitbits as more as tools, but I do think, as we start to get into kind of this observational space, that they could potentially be used to monitor more closely in that space, and, being supplemented with some accelerometers.
You mentioned that we need advanced methods for making use of large volumes of data. And in all of the projects that you described, there certainly were large volumes of data. What are the analytic methods that you are currently using? And do you have thoughts about what you might like to be able to use beyond what you have available today?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I think that we are definitely not making the most use out of our data right now. So we're using, multi-level modeling, more traditional statistical techniques. But I do think, there's an potential opportunity for using things like machine learning and, more predictive analytics, to better not only understand behavior, but kind of to use that within our interventions to make them even more personalized. And so I think that is a really interesting direction to head, and we're interested in going that route at some point.
You described a couple of projects that include intervention activities. The first one, I think, was more of an observational study, but the others included intervention activities. Did you do any sort of tailoring for individuals of any of the intervention components, or did everybody get the same online gym, the same phone coaching, the same version of each of the components?
So in the Fit2Thrive study, the most design, that initial one I talked about, everybody got the same version. We didn't do any tailoring because, we really want to, I think, one of the benefits of most is to some extent you can kind of figure out what component might work for most people, because I always struggle a little bit with like how much to tailor. And with the Fit2Thrive MB study, we are doing some tailoring in that their goal is kind of changing to meet them where they are, but still trying to help, promote activity. But for the most part, we've delivered our components a little bit more standard.
In the first project, you reported some significant effects for within subject analyses, but not between subject analyses. What do you make of that? So people, I interpret that to mean that people who have different levels of self-efficacy or whatever didn't show significant differences in physical activity, but people whose self-efficacy changed did show some effect on physical activity. What do you make of the finding for within subject but not for between subject?
I think part of it is probably power. So we were really powered for the within subject analyses, but looked at the between subjects. So I think that could be some of it. But I do think that, taking it at face value, it does indicate that it's, there is potentially, if you're deviating from your normal, that might, like looking at people's, deviations from their normal may actually be even more important than necessarily looking at these between person differences. But again, we weren't powered really for those between differences. So if we had a larger sample size, we might have actually seen some of those become significant.
Did you look at combinations of the intervention components in the MOST trial or just the main effects?
We looked at the combinations and none of them were significant either.
Okay. I realize power is lower for
yeah.
those. How do you think the environment might be better incorporated into studies that involve technological interventions?
I definitely think we can do more with it. So you could, in my mind, the idea is like we send these text messages that are like, oh, go up, go for a walk. We try to not make them like, oh, it's a beautiful day, go for a walk, because they're not actually context aware. But I think you could make more, context aware messages like, oh, you're by a park, go for a walk, or it's, going to be a great day to get outside. Go, think about going for a walk. And so I definitely think there's room for that. One of the things we are doing with our Fit2Thrive data is we are actually pulling all the data on, we're geocoding it, and then we're actually looking at some of the data from the National Weather Service to see in relation to Fitbit to kind of see how these things might might influence physical activity during the intervention, looking at the Fitbit data. So I definitely think there's room to make our interventions more context aware based on data on like physical location, weather, and factors like that.
I have two questions related to engagement. One, how do you keep the participants engaged? And two, how did you get the healthcare providers engaged?
The second question we're hoping is still, we're hoping they will be engaged. So the first question, getting participants engaged. I do think for, it's with any kind of research, you do kind of, we get the people who are probably a little bit more motivated. Then, we're not probably reaching the people who have no interest in technology or physical activity. But I think, one of the things we do is even in the MOST study, our initial study, we do kind of monitor their activity data. And if someone stops transmitting data for a week, like if we know Fitbit data from them for a week, we would give them a quick call and email them and just say, hey, just checking in, making sure everything's okay. So just to kind of make sure that like they knew that, we were, I guess, watching them to some extent. So that probably helped. But you can see like with some of our other data from like the online gym, like we didn't do a very good job potentially engaging them in that strategy. And it might have just been too low touch. And if I had to, like what we're using the online gym in our the EHR integration study, and that is a much more enhanced version that is fueled by, you know, a little bit of a better budget and an RO1 than in our K award. But I think it's, you know, it's kind of hard, you know, it's hard to engage people, and it'll be interesting to see, because they had access to the app, what happens in that follow-up period. If they were still engaged when we kind of just let them do their thing, I imagine it's probably going to go down. And then in terms of engaging healthcare providers, you know, we're still struggling with this. We have oncologists from both institutions on the grant as co-investigators. And, you know, we've gotten various buy-in from other of the clinicians kind of in their clinics, but we go to their disease team meetings. We really like talk to them about it. We work with the nurse practitioners and, you know, just kind of put a lot of energy into building those relationships and making sure that they don't forget about us.
You're using randomized trial methods. Mm-hmm. And whenever someone gives a presentation on this webinar about using a randomized trial, somebody always asks, geez, is there an alternative to a randomized design? Do I have to use a randomized trial? I have my own thoughts about that, but I thought I would give you the first shot.
That is a good question. You know, I guess I was trained in randomized trials, and I still probably drink the Kool-Aid that, you know, I like to have. I think, you know, having a comparison group allows us to make conclusions about the efficacy of different components. I mean, like in our Fit2Thrive intervention, you know, we don't have any true comparison group. Everyone gets something, but we are comparing the different conditions on or off. In our, you know, our non-responders trial, we actually are not randomizing to start, but we are randomizing at the end. So I do think, you know, it still gives us, it is still considered like the gold standard for comparison. But I think that, you know, as our methods develop, it is something to consider about how we might evaluate trials differently.
Yeah. My regular answer to that question is that the randomized trial is the gold standard. It gives the strongest evidence about causal inference, and that all of the alternatives that are out there, and I've looked at many of them, either cost more to do well, provide less rigorous data on the question. They just don't work as well. And so we're always looking for something that's less expensive and easier to do, but using non-randomized methods isn't necessarily the way to go.
Yep, I would agree with that.
Last question. In I think one of your studies, and maybe I didn't hear this correctly, it sounded like the participants were going to interact with one another, either online or on the phone or something. And we've had presentations on this webinar series about studies that randomize individuals, but then allow the individuals to interact with one another post-randomization. And that creates problems if it's not accounted for in the power calculations and the analysis. And I wonder if that's something that you're familiar with, or if that's something that we should talk more about.
Yes, so I'm definitely familiar with it, because actually in my K, when we had, in my mind, I had originally thought that we would have some interaction between participants, and then, you know, quickly realized that that was going to get very, very messy, very, very fast, and we were going to be severely underpowered. And so in our trial that we're currently doing that is our feasibility acceptability trial. And so we are allowing participants to communicate with one another online or within the app. And to see, I mean, really the point of that is to see, like, if they like it, if they use it, if it's even worth trying to pursue, to be honest. And I think, you know, in later stages, we would definitely, if we do continue on to, you know, group participants together, we would need to consider that in our power analyses.
Yeah. Okay. So the initial effort is more aimed at feasibility rather than testing and intervention. Okay. So that sounds like a good plan. Dr. Phillips, I want to thank you very much. We've reached the end of our time. Terrific webinar. Lots of questions. We did not get to them all. We will send you questions that we didn't get to, and hope that you'd be willing to take a little time to jot down answers, and we can post that on the website when we post the recording.
Yes, I'm definitely happy to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Murray.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, and thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be posting the slides and a recording of today's session on our website next week. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording when it's available. Thank you.